One of my very favorite game series of all time has got to be the Yakuza franchise, because each of them is so incredibly different. They're like slice of life games that give you a chance to wander the streets of Japan in almost photorealistic graphics, going into arcades, doing martial arts, really kind of discovering different secrets of the seedy underworld. But while playing through a bunch of the Yakuza games, I kept hearing legends of this supposedly epic, amazing Yakuza game they never brought out in America, which was called Like a Dragon Ishin. Well, they finally did it. They brought back one of the weirdest games that originally came out on the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4 back in 2014. They finally translated it, and I've been playing a bunch of it. Ishin, though, is a very different experience from the rest of the Yakuza franchise, for better and for worse. But let's talk about that. What's up, gamers? DreamcastGuy here. Hi, hope you're having a great day. If you could like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. Now, let's start things off by discussing what specifically is the most drastically different about Ishin from the rest of the Like a Dragon franchise. I'm sure, as you have immediately noticed, this is not the bright, flashy streets of Japan you're probably used to. This is the feudal era. Specifically, it's around the 1890s. It is very long ago, and this is, in Japanese history, a very, very bloody time period. It's the end of the Edo period. This is basically a bunch of ancient lords that were all chopping each other up. And now, we are definitely in the middle of it. Now, if you've played the Yakuza games, you're probably expecting these people to have particular names. There is a lot of very famous characters at the center of the Yakuza games. Characters that I love a lot. People like Kiryu Kazuma or Goro Majima. These names may not mean a lot to you. Well, in this game, they've done something very strange, but also kind of bold. What they're doing is, this is an actual historical story with real characters that are actually in the history books, but being played by the characters we know. So, Kiryu Kazuma, who is the main character of the Yakuza franchise, is playing Sakamoto Ryōma. A lot of heroes and villains that we already recognize from this very great series, these characters are all back, but serve a very different purpose. It almost feels like watching a movie, and it's actors that we recognize, but in different roles, enjoying this very chaotic period of literal backstabbing and a lot of big goofy boss fights. Now, my very favorite part of the Yakuza games is definitely the fact that, honestly, the ridiculousness of them. They really do manage to keep this in such a goofy, fun, entertaining manner while going on a very bloody adventure. So the main crux of this, before we start to explain the new gameplay, the story is basically, in the most simple way possible, our father, our adoptive dad, is killed by ninjas. And it turns out that he was part of a big political party. He was like part of a local election. So we end up joining the local militia in order to try and investigate and get to the bottom of this very, very gory mystery. And I have to say, I like most of the main story in this, but it definitely feels a lot slower. The biggest problem with this game that you're going to hear me mention multiple times during the course of this video is that this feels a bit outdated. The later Yakuza games that have come out over the course of the last couple years have been complete masterpieces, like Yakuza Like a Dragon, which came out just 2 years ago, even games like Judgment and Lost Judgment. I'm completely obsessed with these. These are sort of murder mysteries, but you're like a judge, or sorry, not a judge, you're a lawyer. I love the fact that this universe has so much space for weird tales, but this one feels a little bit more boring in the middle bits. It takes it a while to get going, and then once it starts going, it never quite hits the highs of other Yakuza games. And I do feel like it is because this was technically written 10 years ago. It doesn't have that extra decade of polish that the newer games will have the luxury of. Now that we've talked about the story and the timeline, let's discuss the combat, because this is incredibly freaking fun. I have always loved the fighting in the Like a Dragon saga. These are very, very goofy, over-the-top, insanely intense fights where you're trying to do hand-to-hand combat, or disarming people, or doing heat takedowns, which are like big special attacks. Honestly, this franchise, from top to bottom, has some incredibly good fights. But here, they've brought in a stance system. Now, this technically existed back in Yakuza 0, but here, they've really taken it one step further. Whenever a fight begins, you can very easily just press any of the buttons on the D-pad to switch between drastically different fighting styles, meaning that, like, if you go for the barehanded brawler, you can parry blows or even pick up objects off the ground, throwing stuff, or even grapple people and do special attacks, slamming them into their friends. There's katana stance, which in my opinion is by far the best. This allows you to, of course, wield a huge freaking sword, but also block, and block very efficiently. You can do some long sword combos, and as you go into the talent trees for each of these different stances, you unlock a ton of special abilities, more special attack juice, extra attacks that let you carry out your combos longer, and even straight up more base damage. But then there is the most hilarious stance, and one I did use pretty much half the time, which is the gunslinger. You have a gun in feudal Japan. Now, technically, this is historically accurate. There were some guns out there, but they definitely couldn't do this. You could just shoot and shoot. Of course, you have infinite ammo because it's a video game, an RPG on top of that, but it is hilarious to just blam, 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 blam. It is so goofy. I don't think the gun stance is overpowered. I mean, the bullets themselves do surprisingly little damage, and even if you do manage to snipe somebody as they're running at you, they're still probably going to get a couple good hits in on you. There is a final stance, but in my opinion, it's the only stance that kind of sucks, which is called Wild Dancer. This is where you're using a sword in one hand and a gun in the other hand. It has no defensive capabilities. It's just made to kind of spray bullets and slashes all over the place. It's funny, but I don't think anybody would actually use it. Even going into the talent trees, it's not particularly strong. I will say, I think this combat system is incredibly freaking fun. A majority of this game is sort of wandering about from place to place, kind of helping out villagers and, of course, investigating the murder of your adoptive father, which means you get into a lot of random fights. You are straight up walking through the streets of feudal Japan, and while you're here, people will walk up. Mercenaries, other Ronin, rival factions, even bandits and outlaws, thieves will try and kill you. And during these random fights, it feels spectacular to keep switching stances, switching combat styles, and absolutely wrecking these fools. But that does bring me to the one major gripe I have, which may sound a little bit unfair. This game feels outdated. I very much love the more recent Yakuza games because they have what's called the Dragon Ishin. They actually rebuilt a bunch of the newer games so that now you can walk straight into any building with no load screens. Anytime you go into a shop here, it's either just a menu you can select, or going into the interior of buildings, it always has to have a tiny load screen. Also, stuff like the newer games, you can see enemies on the map, so if you want to try and sneak down an alley and avoid a fight, you can do that. Here, fights kind of just get thrown on you. Everything here definitely feels slightly outdated, even within this same franchise. I'm glad this exists, but as a Mega fan, it just feels a bit odd to take this step back in design progression for this very slightly outdated spin-off. The other problem I have is it just comes down to the fact that, honestly, I don't like the spin-off side stuff as much. Typically, my very favorite aspect of each of the Yakuza games has always been the side quests. You deal with people that are wannabe time travelers, people setting bombs in the city that you have to defuse, trying to help out people that are in giant diapers and stuff like that. The side content in this game is still fun, but it's not quite as fun. I did do some side quests where, like, I went into a dojo that focused on hand-to-hand combat, and I ended up beating up the students to try and teach them a lesson to focus harder and listen to their masters. I've helped sumo wrestlers get a good bite to eat so they could train for that next major mission. I've done all sorts of like escort missions where there's a princess being smuggled out of town in a box, and I have to defend that box from a group of what are basically horny gym bros. I mean, the game is still funny, it's still fun, but I honestly kind of miss the bright, shiny streets of modern-day Japan. I liked side quests that would have me doing dating hotlines or straight up just going to the arcade and challenging somebody to a darts competition. And that brings me to the mini games themselves, which are normally my very favorite part of the game entirely. I mean, I'll go back even years later and play old Yakuza games just to run around the streets and try out drone racing or playing in those arcades that I love so much, which have actual licensed Sega games in them. This time around, you're getting stuff like you can gamble, you can play very old school Japanese dice and card games, which I'll admit, a lot of these, even after trying to play a bunch of them, I do not understand the rules of feudal age dice games. They're so bizarre. You can do chicken race gambling, where you're trying to bet on chickens running around a track. There's a fishing minigame where you can throw bait and try and fish. Karaoke is back, which is a very classic staple, but it doesn't quite feel as good as the newer Yakuza games. Of course, there's dancing. There is a very big farming minigame where you actually have a farmstead and you're able to plant crops, harvest it, learn to cook, make healing potions and stuff for later in the game. This is a big separate chunk of the game itself. I kind of think it's interesting, but I'm not really an Animal Crossing style guy. So I'll be honest, after I did a bunch of the initial tutorials figuring out how to set up my farm, I kind of went sayonara. I like this game a lot when it comes to that moment-to-moment combat. After playing so many of these Yakuza games, it's nice to go through like a Dragon Ishin, wielding my sword blade, maxing out my stats, getting justice, unleashing my trooper cards. There's like these special random abilities. You build like a deck of helpers that let you unleash electric attacks. I mean, they're basically magic. You can heal yourself or do haste to have faster attack speed. I like a lot of what they're attempting to do with this game, even if I feel like it's a bit strange. I got a copy of this for free from Sega, and honestly, I enjoyed it so much, I bought a copy for myself. So I have a copy coming in the mail on PlayStation 5. This game is not for everybody, but for Yakuza fans looking for that next taste of Like a Dragon, this is a hit. But we've heard some good and some bad. Let's head over to the ratings board and put a big number on it. I am giving Like a Dragon Ishin an 8 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching, gamers. If you enjoyed this video, give it a big old thumbs up, share with your friends, and subscribe if you haven't already, and please keep dreaming. Tomorrow, there is a big review of Atomic Heart coming out. Well, I'm editing both these videos at once. Maybe this is coming out tomorrow. Watch out for an Atomic Heart review. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm not sure when these videos are being released. I have so much editing to do. Thanks so much for watching that video. If you want to see something else, you can always click this link to see what I put up last, or, subscribe and see what's coming up next. Also, I promise that whatever I do, it'll try not to suck.